Chapter 5. Norman had been dancing happily through his morning's work. Between customers he had skipped backwards and forwards, turning the enamel door handle and squinting into the gloom to assure himself that all was as it should be. The wheel had been tirelessly spinning for more than 4 hours now, and showed no signs whatsoever of grinding to a halt. As the Memorial Library clock struck 1 in the distance, he turned his sign to the closed for lunch side, bolted up, and pranced away to his sanctum sanctorum. The wheel was an undoubted success, and as such meant that phase 1 of his latest, and in his own humble opinion undeniably greatest, project was complete. Norman slipped off his shopkeeper's overall and donned a charred leather apron and a pair of welder's goggles. Dusting down his rubber gloves with a tube of baby powder, he drew them over his sensitive fingers and flexed these magical appendages. With a flourish, he dragged aside a length of gingham tablecloth which curtained off a tiny alcove in one corner of the crowded room. Upon a worm-eaten kitchen chair sat another Norman. Clad in grey shopkeeper's work coat, shirt, tie, trousers, and worn brown brogues, he was a waxen effigy of the Madame Tussauds variety. The scientific shopkeeper chuckled, and, reaching out a rubber-clad finger, tickled his doppelganger under the chin. "Afternoon, Norman," he said. The double did not reply, but simply sat staring sightlessly into space. It was as near a perfect representation of its living counterpart as it was possible to be. And so it might well have been, considering the long years of Norman's labour. Countless thousands of hours had gone into its every detail. Every joint in its skeletal frame was fully articulated, with friction-free bearings of the shopkeeper's own design. The cranial computer banks were loaded to the very gunwales with all the necessary information, which would enable it to perform the mundane and tiresome duties required of a corner shopkeeper, whilst its creator could dedicate the entirety of his precious time to the more essential matters of which Phase 3 of the project were composed. All it lacked was that essential spark of life, and this now ground away upon the kitchen table at precisely 26 revolutions per minute. Norman chuckled anew, and drew his masterpiece erect. Unbuttoning the shirt, he exposed the rubberized chest region which housed the hydraulic unit designed to stimulate the motions of breathing. Tinkering with his screwdriver, he removed the frontal plate and applied a couple of squirts of 3-in-1 to the brace of mountings, identical in shape and size to those which now cradled the ever-spinning wheel. He had sought far and wide for a never-failing power supply, having previously nothing to hand save clumsy mains cables, which, even when disguised by poking from trouser bottoms, left his progeny little scope for locomotion. This compact unit would do the job absolutely. Norman crossed to the table, and with a set of specially fashioned tongs, carefully lifted the spinning wheel upon its polished axle rod. It turned through space gyroscopically. If nothing else, it would certainly keep the robot standing upright. With a satisfying click, the wheel fell into place, and Norman closed the chest cavity and rebuttoned the shirt, straightening the tie and work coat lapels. The shopkeeper stepped back to view his mirror image. Perfection. There was a gentle flutter of movement about the chest region, a sudden blinking of eyelids and focusing of eyes, a yawn, a stretch. Clearing its throat with a curiously mechanical coughing sound, the creature spoke. "Good afternoon, sir," it said. Norman clapped his hands together and danced one of his favourite silly dances. "Wonderful," he said with glee. "Wonderful." The robot smiled crookedly in the manner of its maker. "I am happy that you find all to your satisfaction," said he. "Oh, indeed, indeed. How are you then, Norman? Are you well?" "A bit stiff, sir, as it happens, but I expect that I will wear in. Is there anything in particular you would like doing?" Norman clapped his hands. "How about a cup of tea? What do you think?" "Certainly, sir." The robot stretched himself again and waggled each foot in turn. Norman watched in sheer exultation as his other self performed its first task. The tea was exactly as he would have made it himself. "You will pardon me if I don't join you, sir," said the pseudo shopkeeper, "but I do not feel at all thirsty." At a little after 3 p.m, Pooley and Omally left the Flying Swan. As the two friends strode off down the Ealing Road, Neville, the part-time barman, pressed home the brass bolts and padded away to his quarters. The floorboards groaned suspiciously beneath his tread, but Neville, now buoyed up with a half-bottle of bells, closed his ears to them. "Right then," said Omally, "to business. It is yet 3 p.m, and we have not yet earned a penny." "I've missed the bookies," said Jim. "I'm £100,000 down already." "The day may yet be saved. Positive thinking is your man. To work then." Pooley shook his head and departed gloomily down Albany Road, en route for the allotment. Omally squared up his shoulders and entered Norman's corner shop. Behind the counter stood Norman, idly thumbing through a copy of Wet Girls in the Raw. Beneath the counter crouched another Norman, chuckling silently into his hands. "Afternoon, Norman," said Omally. "Back of the Reds, if you please, and a half-ounce of Gordon." The mechanical confectioner cleared his throat with a curiously mechanical coughing sound. "Certainly, sir," said he, turning away to seek out these articles from their niches. Below the counter, Norman clicked his tongue in silent displeasure. Above the counter, O'Malley's hand had snaked into the peppermint rack and drew a packet away to his trouser pocket. Norman would have to chalk that one up to experience and punch a few more defence mechanisms into the machine's computer banks. He scribbled a hurried note on a discarded ice cream wrapper and awaited developments. He did not have to wait long. "Stick them on my slate, please, Norm," said Omally. "Pardon me, sir." "On my slate. I'll settle up with you later." "I regret, sir, that I cannot allow you to leave the premises without having first paid for the goods. Such is the way with commerce. You understand." Below the counter, Norman chewed upon his knuckles. This was much better. He patted his creation upon the trouser knee and gave it the old thumbs up. "Please do not ask for credit, sir," said the robot, "as a smack in the mouth so often offends." "What?" Omally surveyed the shopkeeper with open horror. This was not the way business was done. Not the way it had been done for the last 15 years. He did not expect to actually leave the shop without paying, unless of course he caught Norman on one of those occasions when he'd been testing his homemade sprout beer. But this... Omally pushed back his flat cap and tugged at his curly forelock. Was this simply some new ploy, perhaps? Maybe Norman had been reading some American magazine about self-assertion or the like. He'd play it along. "My knees ache something wicked," he said, changing the subject. A mystified look appeared upon the robot Norman's face. "I'm sorry to hear that, sir," said he sympathetically. "It's the cycling, I believe," John continued. "Constantly forcing the pedals round and round and around. I'd be lost without a bike, of course. It's my only means of transport. But I do believe that the physical effort required by the cycling is slowly crippling me." The robot Norman shook his head sadly. "That is a pity," he sighed. "Yes, if only there was some alternative to be had for the eternal pedalling. Around and around and around." O'Malley's hand made the appropriate movements in the air. "If you know what I mean." The sub-counter Norman nodded. He was already way ahead of him. The duplicate, however, seemed not to have grasped it as yet. "Could you not possibly trade in the bike for a car or something?" he suggested. "A car?" Omally looked askance at the shopkeeper. "A car? How long have you known me, Norman?" The Irishman did not hear the purring of cogs and the meshing of computer mechanisms as the robot sought out the answer to his question. "Precisely 15 years, 2 months, 9 days, he said. "You were, if I recall, wearing the same cap and trousers." "And do you suppose that the man who is still wearing this cap and trousers is the sort of man who could afford to buy a car?" "I'm not giving the matter any thought as yet, sir," said the robot. "But if you like, I will apply myself to it whilst you are paying for your purchases." Omally chewed upon his lip. He did not like the smell of this one little bit. "So how goes the work then?" he asked, changing the subject once more. "Business is slack as ever. The monthly returns are down again." "No, not the shop. I mean your work." Omally gestured towards the kitchenette door. "What wonders are germinating in your little den?" "If you will pardon me, sir," said the robot, reaching forward, "it is becoming apparent to me that you have no intention of paying for your purchases. Would you kindly hand them back?" "Norman, are you all right?" The robot suddenly lunged forward across the counter and grasped Omally by a tweedy lapel. "Be warned," said the Irishman. "I know Dimmack." Beneath the counter, a sudden terror gripped the heart of the hidden shopkeeper. He had programmed the entirety of Count Dante's Dimmock Manual of Martial Arts into his creation as a precaution against it being attacked. O'Malley's statement he knew well enough to be pure bravado, but he doubted that the robot would take it as such. "Thou say'n so," said the duplicate, drawing Omally from his feet. "And hence." With a deft flick of an automated wrist, which the now legendary Count catalogued as Move 32A, the curl of the dark dragon's tail, Omally found himself catapulted through the air in a flailing backward somersault, which ended in a sprawling confusion amidst a tangle of magazine racks and out-of-date chocolate boxes. "You blackguard," said John, spitting and drawing back his sleeves. Norman cowered in the darkness, covering his ears. The robot climbed nimbly across the counter and stood over the fallen Irishman. "The tobacco and the papers," said he, extending a hand. "Come now," said John, "be reasonable. What's all this about? You can't go attacking people over a pack of tobacco. Have you gone mad?" Whilst the robot was considering an answer to this question, Omally struck out with a devastating blow to the shopkeeper's groin. There was a sharp metallic clang and a sickening bone-splintering report. "My God!" groaned John, falling back and gripping at his knee. "What you wearing? A cast-iron codpiece?" The robot was on him in a flash, and whilst Norman cowered in the darkness, saying the rosary and praying desperately for the little brass wheel he had so recently set in motion to irrevocably break down, the martial duplicate lifted his struggling charge high above his head and cast him once more across the shop. This time, however, there was little to cushion O'Malley's fall. He struck the shop's aged front door, carrying it from its hinges, and flew out into the Ealing Road to land across the bonnet of a parked Morris Minor. It is certain that a lesser man would not possibly have survived such an assault, but O'Malley, momentarily numbed, merely slid down the driver's side of the car bonnet and prepared once more to come up fighting. "Nuts and noses," his daddy always told him, and it was obvious that nuts were at present out of the question.